This is the study I decided to do, and it's major doctrines we've learned since May 21, 2011. So we know absolutely this world must be destroyed. It's not going to be made over. It's going to be absolutely, utterly destroyed, and a new heaven and new earth will come. And so any language in the Bible that does describe a literal physical destruction would be on the final day of this prolonged judgment. And that's the third major point. The third thing we've learned that hasn't been known is that the final judgment is a prolonged period of time. It's a prolonged period of time that, again, we didn't know, or at least I didn't know, until Mr. Camping began speaking of the 5 months. So he saw that. See, it wasn't fitting because there was the language that locked in May 21, 2011. Then there was the language pointing to the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, which was exactly 5 months later, if you remember. And there's also the language of suffering and torment that had to be carried out and fulfilled, that cannot be carried out and fulfilled if Christ comes and ends the world there. And that understanding came as a result of learning about annihilation, that was God's plan. You can't have... See, they thought many of these verses that speak of man's suffering had to be carried out throughout eternity. Christ comes over in an instant, judgment of all unsaved. Then the suffering and torment takes place over the course of eternity, future, forever and ever and ever. But once you learn, well, you can't have that suffering take place for all eternity because the Bible teaches man is cut off, he perishes in that day, his thoughts perish and so forth. Then you got a problem. And the solution to the problem appeared to be the literal 5 months. But really the solution is a prolonged judgment day. And we were incorrect about the length, the duration of a literal 5 months. But we were correct with the idea of a prolonged period of time that's considered by God to be 1 day. 1 day, judgment day. And that allows God to do many things where he can carry out a spiritual judgment for years, as we're learning. And then on the very last day, have the physical, literal destruction that we read in the Bible too. And both can be together because they're all taking place within what God calls Judgment Day, a Judgment Day period. And that's why it may even be when we read of the last day language, we'll raise them up at the last day, that has to do with the very final day, whatever day that is. Biblical evidence is pointing to 2033. That last day would be the day of annihilation and the day of the resurrection and the day of the rapture. And so learning about the prolonged judgment day also is new information that when we check the Bible, we find statements that support it, such as in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verse 11, which says, "Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil." So think about that. God is speaking of sentence against an evil work. That's a judgment. A judge sentences the criminal, and the judgment is said to be something that is not executed speedily. What's another way of saying that? It's a slow process. It's going to be carried out over time, not immediately. And that's the problem with Matthew 24:29 and those who think, well, that's the end of the world instantaneously. Immediately after the tribulation, the sun is darkened and the moon does not give its light and the stars fall from heaven. And there's lots and lots of theologians and there are people who listen to them, professed Christians who think that's the end of the world. That's the end of the world. But no, and we can explain that when Christ is coming immediately as the judge to execute judgment, the sentence of God against the sinners, but the execution of the judgment is not immediate. It is not instantaneous. He does not as a matter of fact, execute his sentence speedily, but he does it slowly. He does it very, very slowly. He carries it out. And then we also know from Hebrews chapter 3 that God is able to call a prolonged period of time a single day. As it says in Hebrews 3, verse 8, harden not your hearts as in the provocation, in the day of temptation, in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my works 40 years. What was that 40-year period called? The day of temptation. The day. And it's even in Genesis where God speaks of the day he made the heavens and the earth. And we know Genesis, the account says it was 6 days, but God says it was the day. So he can take a period of time, and it's a long period of time maybe, and call it a day. Judgment Day. And anybody who disputes that is just not being honest when it comes to the Bible. Because if they say, now you're crazy, Judgment Day is a day. It's a 24-hour period. It's not years. How ridiculous. Well, then just ask them, how long was the day of salvation? How long was the day of salvation? Well, centuries. So long a period of time, and God identifies that whole period of time as a day. So if many centuries can be considered a day, then why can't 22 years, 23 inclusive years be counted or considered as a day in God's Word? And the answer is there's no problem with that at all. They can be considered a day, and it is being considered a day. And that's one of the major things we've learned. And we're learning these things because, again, May 21 locked in. And see, that's where you start. And that's where anyone in these days of judgment, these days after the tribulation, has to begin in coming to an understanding. You have to start there, because then you ask these questions. Well, if it's Judgment Day, why isn't the world burning with literal fires and flames? Spiritual. If it's Judgment Day, then why didn't it all end on May 21 or October 21 or the date October 7th, 2015? Because that happened to be the 10,000th day. Why is it going on so long? Prolonged Judgment Day. We just keep going back to the Bible, and the Bible then provides the answers. If we were incorrect, if we were off course, the Bible would not provide the answers. But when we start progressing and learning more and more, that's only because we're on the right track and we're going the right way. And so we're learning the things that God would have us to know. Okay, then, the timeline for Judgment Day emerges. And I just mentioned 22 years, 23 inclusive. And when I began to look into 2033, by God's grace, it just opened up. With timelines. Timeline is like a doctrine. It has to have support. When it's understood, it has to be fairly direct. For example, the flood to May 21, 2011 was 7,000 years to the equivalent self-same day, because the underlying Hebrew calendar date. That's very direct. And, it helps us to see when it's so direct. And from creation to the flood, 6,023 years. From the flood to the cross in 33 AD, 5,023 calendar years. Very direct, maybe with that 23-year tribulation period tacked on. Well, then when you look at 2033, it has perhaps the best evidence pointing to it than any previous date, because it is following the pattern of Christ's first coming, and I won't go into all the timelines, but from creation to 2033 would be identical from creation to the cross. As far as the timeline, 11,045, 46 years, and 2033, 13,045, 46 years. From creation to the flood, 6,023 years. From the flood to 2033, 7,023 calendar years. and many more, from the foundation of Solomon's temple, 3,000 exact years, or from the cross to 2033, 2,000 exact years, and so forth. Direct time pass, strong time pass. So then a biblical timeline emerges that when it's 1990 something, you're not looking at 2033. But since all these other dates had come and gone, then we started looking at that, and it fits. It fits. And it ties in, especially because 2033 is 23 inclusive years from 2011. And the number 23 is a tribulation number, which would be another major doctrine that we've learned. At this time, if 2011 and 2033 is a tribulation period, and I thought 1988 to 2011 was a tribulation. So then again, we learn that there's two tribulations. There's two tribulations. There is a tribulation on the church and a tribulation on the world. And actually, then we can say, a tribulation is just a synonym for the word judgment. Judgment begins at the house of God. Tribulation on the church. Judgment begins with the world. Tribulation on the world. And now we're learning something else, because the tribulation's always been a complicated thing when there was only one of them. We understood there to be 23 years, and that broke up into two parts, 2,300 days plus 17 years. Because that is completed, now we're learning there's a second one. As we learn there's a second one, we also learn the reason is because God is recompensing or repaying Satan and his forces, the kingdom of darkness, for the first one. Because that during the first tribulation, the judgment on the church, they dared to stretch forth their hand against God's anointed. And of course, that was according to God's will, his purpose. But nonetheless, he didn't let them get away with that. And so we read in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 4, where it says, "So that we ourselves glory in you, in the churches of God, for your patience and faith, in all your persecutions and tribulations that ye endure." Tribulations plural, just as in Ephesians 3:13, where it says, "Faint not at my tribulations for you." And of course, we all have numerous personal experience with tribulations, and that's how we read it. But since we are learning from the Bible, there's two tribulations. And what is the great temptation, the great fear for all of us? That we might faint, that we might not make it, that we might falter at some point and not endure to the end. Faint not at my tribulations for you, especially when you successfully, by God's grace, apparently, made it through the first. And isn't it a tragedy where someone's made it all the way through 23 years and then they get into the second and they don't realize it, they don't understand it, and then they turn back. They turn back and they retreat and they get off that path. It was just God bringing one tribulation to a close and beginning a second. And yet they fainted and they've gone back. And yet God says, don't faint at my tribulations for you.